Thank you, Vipanchika. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon in this part of the world, and welcome to our second lecture as part of the Social Reproduction Theory Lab series. Before I introduce our amazing speaker, I want you to understand, those of you who are not in the US, the gravity of the political situation and of online communities and meetings that we are hosting at the moment. So I request that for your own safety, as well as the safety of the speaker and the organizers, you keep your comments to the subject that is being presented before you, and try to keep your politics apparent, but perhaps not if it endangers any of the vulnerable people who are signing on to this session. Please note that because of the nature of our politics and the nature of social reproduction theory, a lot of vulnerable folks log on to these meetings. And so I would like you to be mindful of their status and their positions in society in this current moment in America. That said, I must also thank my co-organizers and who have made this series a stunning success over starting in the January of this year, 2025. All of the recordings of the past meetings are online on YouTube, so please hear them if you have missed any previous sessions. My co-organizers on this project is Professor Erin Jaffe, who is a professor of philosophy at Juilliard, and Professor Susan Ferguson, who is a professor emeritus from Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. It goes without saying that nothing would have been possible without the research assistant on this project, Vipanchika Bhagyanagar, who is going to write a stunning PhD on carcerality. And we are very thankful, Vipanchika, for all your work on this series. So now, without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Sara Farris. Dr. Sara Farris is a sociologist with expertise in migration, gender, and the political economy of care and social reproduction. Her research is particularly concerned to address the role that migrant and racialized workers play within economies of care and social reproduction, the financialization and corporatization of care, and the racialization of sexism. She is really well known internationally for her research on female nationalism, or the mobilization of feminist themes by nationalist parties within anti-immigration campaigns. Dr. Farris's book on the subject, In the Name of Women's Rights, was published by Duke in 2017 and is a must-read for all feminists. We are very grateful for her time and her valuable contributions to SRT over the years. Sara, dear friend and comrade, welcome to the SRT Lab. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Titi, for this introduction, and especially for co-organizing with Aaron and Sue Vipanchika this amazing lab. I think what you're doing is incredibly valuable, not just in the current political conjuncture. You've done also amazing work, for instance, on social reproduction in Palestine, which I think it's incredibly important. But I think more generally is so important to bring us together to discuss social reproduction, different approaches to social reproduction, which is something that I will address in my presentation today is an approach, or if you like, a paradigm that's been increasingly enriched enormously over the last, I would say, 15 years, as I will try to explain. And it's great to see that we have the possibility of discussing that also in a space like this. Now, because I don't want to indulge in my tendency to speak too much, I will read my paper because I'm conscious that I have a 35 minutes maximum to speak. So I will tell you immediately what my aims in this paper are. So in the past 5 years alone, since COVID really, the number of scholarly publications, research projects and public discussions drawing on the concepts of care ethics and social reproduction feminism has grown exponentially. This newfound popularity is due certainly to the COVID-19 pandemic. Discussions on care and social reproduction have really exploded, particularly that year and in the aftermath of COVID. But I think even before COVID, we have witnessed more interest in social reproduction theories, but also in the ethics of care, in the paradigm of care more generally. Also, I think in light of what Nancy Fraser called the global care crisis. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this term, so I'm not going to discuss this too much. Now, some scholars use care and social reproduction as synonyms or even as interchangeable. Yet, I think there are important differences between these concepts, the theoretical traditions that inform them, as well as their political implications. The key difference between them and the one that's been mostly noted in the literature lies in their understanding of care as either affect or work. While the care ethics literature foregrounds the practice and attitude of caring as imbued mostly with positive affect, social reproduction feminists see care, above all, as work, which reproduces labor power as well as life itself. A second important difference between these two traditions, which I don't think has received the attention that deserved, pertains to these two traditions' understanding of interdependence. For care ethics scholars, interdependence describes the human experience of interconnectedness. Hence, interdependence counters liberalism's independent, autonomous individual, or the self-sufficient monad, who is considered the main unit of society. Social reproduction feminism instead looks at the concept of interdependence mostly from the angle of the interdependence between production and reproduction, and thus it examines how individuals relate to each other on this basis. Against this background, in this paper I have two main aims. The first is to show that the limited debate between proponents of care ethics and social reproduction feminism has been in many ways inadequate and has led to important, I think, oversimplifications. Now here I will focus in particular on some of the oversimplifications that in my view were made by care ethics scholar about social reproduction feminism. And in so doing, I also try to contribute to theorizing or developing dimensions of social reproduction feminism that I don't think that have been fully developed or fully clarified within this feminist tradition itself. More specifically, I will flesh out how social reproduction feminism understands the role of affect within care labor, as well as the importance of Marx's concept of social relations of production. My second aim is to show that this feminist tradition is the ethics of care feminist tradition is underpinned by an idealization of care as moral good, which fundamentally abstracts caring from concrete social and economic relations, and thus operates as a fetish. To put this argument forward, I draw on Marx's theory of commodity fetishism, which maintains that capitalism leads to the illusion that commodities have a life of their own, eliding the actual people behind those commodities, namely the workers who made them. My contention here is that something similar, although in reversed form, if you like, happens in the world of caring under capitalism. While we do see the real people involved in the caring relationship, we overlook the commodities behind those relationships. This is what I call the fetishization of care that capitalism generates and which is deployed rather than challenged by the ethics of care when it emphasizes caring as primarily affect, or that which is in excess of social reproductive labor. Now, the question whether care is labor or in excess of labor is really the dividing line between the political ethics of care and social reproduction feminism. I'm now going really to focus on the first point. So what do we mean by care as affect or care as labor? So for the ethics of care, care is not merely work, insofar as the emotions that constitute the kernel of caring cannot be reduced to an economic category. Instead, for social reproduction feminism, caring activities in the context of capitalism are better understood as work, insofar as, like any activity, they are acts of metabolic exchange with nature and the world that operate directly or indirectly to reproduce capitalist social relations. Yet, while a focus on care as labor, or not only labor, does constitute the pivotal point of contention between these two feminist approaches, I argue that such a distinction is, in fact, an oversimplification. What is left behind and remains unscrutinized when we fail to interrogate this distinction in more depth is the actual meaning of labor and the role that affect play, particularly with the Marxist feminist tradition of social reproduction. Furthermore, an uncritical focus on labor that does not consider its meaning risks concealing the nature of affects themselves for both the ethics of care and social reproduction feminism. Now, as I briefly mentioned, social reproduction feminism draws its concept of labor from the young Marx, who understood it as the active exchange that human beings carry out with nature to renew the conditions for their existence. By organizing and regulating their activities in a conscious exchange with the world that surrounds them, individuals express and develop their cognitive powers and build their subjectivity. Labor for Marx is the intentional pursuit through which human beings satisfy their needs, which include affective emotions as much as objects, and which are modified historically alongside the changes in the material world in which humans operate. While aiming to recover this fundamental insight of the young Marx in particular, social reproduction feminists also criticize Marx for having overlooked the laboring activities that go into reproducing life and labor power. So when social reproduction feminists demand to recognize life-making activities as labor, I would argue they do not mean to obfuscate or minimize their affective and emotional dimensions. Insofar as the Marxian definition of labor that is invoked understands labor as the willful interaction with the world through which humans build themselves as subjects, it is simply impossible to separate labor from an affective experience. To foreground care as work, then, is not meant to take away from its emotional aspects or to demote them. By insisting that the caring activities of looking after children, for instance, are essential labor for capitalism, social reproduction feminism is pointing out that these activities, whether waged or unwaged, are enmeshed in capitalist social relations that they unwittingly reproduce. Not only is putting a child to bed, feeding them, and educating them the labor of reproducing the future generations of workers, but also the extent to which that child can be more or less well-fed, rested, loved, and educated ultimately depends upon the time, means, and abilities available to the carer in the context of the material, social, and cultural constraints in which capitalist demands place them. The central distinction between the political ethics of care and social reproduction feminism, then, is not whether care is merely labor or merely affect. But I think it is about the type of affect that these two traditions acknowledge as part of the caring experience. For the ethics of care, as I noted, the excess that care is maintained to represent, as opposed to simply labor, or to merely labor, amounts to love, attentiveness, and sense of responsibility, all qualities that are epitomized by the mother-child relationship. So this tradition constantly refers to this example. This feminist tradition that is fundamentally conceives of care as that activity and practice that brings together individuals through positive affect. Virginia Held, who is one of the main representatives of the ethics of care and wrote a beautiful book, in fact, tried really to systematize 2 decades of research and proposals on the ethics of care. So Virginia Held makes it very clear that the attitude that one has towards care is crucial for the quality of the caring relationship. Several scholars have pointed out that the framing of care as fulfilling intimate and emotional engagement, as opposed to the dirty and repetitive labor involved in making lives, to quote Rachel Rosen, who will be one of the speakers also in this series. So this type of framing of care disavows the asymmetries of power and the relations of inequality that characterize caring activities. Gender, care, and migration scholars in particular have unraveled the abuse and imbalances that pervade the world of care workers across the world, a large number of whom are migrant and racialized women. Framing the uncommodified mother-child relation as the epitome of good care also disavows the negative feelings of discontent, isolation, and exhaustion that mothers themselves may feel towards their children. The complexities of affects involved in care, then, are denied when caring is measured against the standards of righteousness that are idealized and in a way impossible to meet. Social reproduction feminism, on the other hand, contends that the affects involved in caring for people are variable and inevitably regimented by capitalism, which in many ways dictates their nature, timing, quality, and mode of expression, whether they take place, again, in waged or unwaged form. So here, sociologist Gutierrez Rodriguez, for instance, in her research on migrant domestic workers in Germany, examined the affects involved in the context of care and domestic labor performed at home in paid form, and the very different meanings they assume for the employee and the employer. For social reproduction feminism, for the affects involved in care are not necessarily those of love and nurture, because the conditions in which caring takes place are often conditions of exploitation, oppression, and frustration. In the words of Silvia Federici, in capitalist society, I'm quoting, reproductive work is not the free reproduction of ourselves or others according to our and their desires. To the extent that directly or indirectly it is exchanged for a wage, reproductive work is at all points subjected to the conditions imposed on it by the capitalist organization and relations of production. End of the quote. The murkiness of caring in a context of deep inequalities is what famously Katz refers to when she points out that social reproduction is the fleshy, and here again I'm quoting, the fleshy, messy, and indeterminate stuff of everyday life. Ultimately, I think the ethics of care operates with an ideal type of caring as a fundamentally positive affect. This typification enables this tradition to produce normative claims for more caring societies. But in doing so, the ethics of care, I think, struggles to describe power asymmetries in the caring experience, as well as the negative emotions that pervade the caring relationship, both in waged and unwaged form. Social reproduction feminism, on the other hand, is underpinned by the fundamental Marxian insight that in capitalist societies, relationships between people cannot really be abstracted from the very concrete material realities in which they take place, nor from the power imbalances between the individuals who are involved in the relationship. Now, I want to move to the concept of interdependence, which, as I anticipated, is perhaps even more important to the ethics of care than the idea of genuine caring as equivalent to feelings of love, empathy, and responsibility. The recognition of the human condition as one in which people depend on each other rather than one of independence and isolation is the fundamental assumption on which the ethics of care literature is based. Conceptually, then, the concept of interdependence is the ontological ground that distances the ethics of care from liberal ethics and theories based on the single individual as the fundamental unit of society. If you read the work by care ethicists, particularly Virginia Woolf, but also John Tronto, their main target really is liberal ethics, the idea that ethics is based upon the singular individual, and they claim, in fact, we need to recognize and acknowledge interdependence. Yet, in spite of its centrality within the care literature, not only does the concept of interdependence appear in many ways unclear and under-theorized, but I think is also haunted by the very premise from which it seeks to escape, namely that of the independent subject as the cornerstone of liberal thought. So this point, for instance, I'm not going to quote it because it's too long, but this point has been made by Gordon and Rottenberg in a recent article on trying to foreground the politics of care as different from the ethics of care. And they, for instance, seem to me to be raising the point that the concept of interdependence in much of the political ethics of care still assumes wittingly or unwittingly that interdependence takes place between independent individuals who are regarded as subjects before and beyond their interconnection with others. But I would also like to add that the ontological assumption of interdependence as the basic feature of the human condition still assumes, more or less explicitly, that interdependence as such equals to, or at least nourishes, leads to, an affective bond between people. The idealization of interdependence as a positive affective experience, however, does not tell us much about the nature of concrete and socially situated relations of interdependence. So I would ask, do individuals codepend, interdepend on each other in the same way? Or to put it differently, is the relation of interdependence one of equality or inequality? And what are the conditions under which those inequalities, if any, manifest themselves? In what ways do they influence the relation of interdependence itself? The concept of interdependence thus returns us, I think, wittingly or unwittingly, to the ideal type of care as the affirming emotional bond that seemingly springs from a relation of codependence between equals. In other words, in essentializing the human experience of interconnectedness as one of interdependence, the ethics of care risks neutralizing the concrete features of the relationship of interdependence itself and disavowing the concrete subjects involved. Many of these points and this critique, for example, have been made by exponents of the disability movement. I can maybe address this if there is any interest later. Now, within the framework of social reproduction feminism, the human reality of interdependence between people is framed and analyzed mainly through the social positions that they occupy and which place them within the connective chain of production and reproduction. But in my view, I'm not fully aware of social reproduction feminists that have developed this concept of interdependence. So I really here borrow mainly from Frances Fox Piven, who I think she's a political theorist, who I think offered a very fitting definition of interdependence for social reproduction feminism, even though she did not belong to social reproduction feminism, does not really discuss this tradition. So in her words, I'm quoting, "All societies organize social life through networks of specialized and interdependent activities. And the more complex the society, the more elaborate these interdependent relations. Networks of cooperation and interdependence inevitably give rise to contention, to conflict, as people bound together by social life try to use each other to further their often distinctive interests and outlooks. And the networks of interdependence that bind people together also generate widespread power capacities to act on these distinctive interests and outlooks. Industrial capitalists depend on workers. The prince depends in some measure on the urban crowd. Merchants depend on customers. Husbands depend on wives. Masters depend on slaves. Landlords depend on tenants, and governing elites in the modern state depend on the acquiescence, if not the approval, of enfranchised publics." End of the quote. As made, I think, clear in the passage above, conceptions that understand the people's interdependence from the interplay of the complex organization of capitalist societies, rather than from the axiomatic assumptions about the innate needs and functioning of the human species, focus not so much on individuals, but rather on the social relations that precede, inform, and surround them, and upon which individuals themselves act in order to change those relations. Thus, I contend that here social reproduction feminism, like Fox-Piven's theory, should draw their conception of interdependency from Marx's important notion of social relations of production. In the context of his discussion on the fetishism of commodities in Capital Volume 1, Marx makes the somewhat provocative and even paradoxical claim that the dominance of the commodity form, which is the cornerstone of the capitalist mode of production, gives rise to a peculiar inversion of relationality. These were not Marx's terms, but it is actually Kevin Floyd, the late Kevin Floyd, that tried to reformulate this idea in Marx using this expression. It is an inverted relationality in the sense that in the context of the commodity exchange, relations between people actually appear as if they were relations between objects. This occurs because capitalism makes us believe that the value of a commodity or its price is intrinsic to the commodity itself, rather than being the expression of the human labor that made that commodity. In other words, Marx maintained that in a complex system with such an elaborate division of labor, such as capitalism, people experience the social nature of their labors through the exchange of their products. So to make these considerations clearer, we could use the example of boycott and divest movements that embargo certain companies' products in protest against their treatment of workers. When boycott campaigners ask people not to buy the commodities produced by a certain company, they are de facto unraveling the social relation that links them as consumers to the workers as producers of those commodities. Boycotters, that is, are showing us the connection that places them in a relationship of interdependence with those workers through their consumption of the products of the workers' social labor, even though they never met and might never meet those actual workers. While interdependence is thus pivotal to both feminist traditions, the ethics of care and social reproduction feminism understand it very differently. The former, so the ethics of care, sees interdependence as the necessary and universal experience of interaction between humans who rely on each other to satisfy basic needs, and in doing so, develop feelings of bonding and caring. The latter analyzes interdependence not so much as a universal and immutable species experience, although it does certainly recognize that human beings as social beings are interdependent, but as a form of interconnection that is heavily influenced by the specific material circumstances in which people find themselves. In the context of capitalism, the nature of interdependence is mediated by the place that people occupy within social relations of production and reproduction, and the social hierarchies that result from such relations. Social reproduction feminism thus explicates how for many, and perhaps most people, interdependence might not take the form of mutual recognition and attentiveness, but also, and sometimes simultaneously, the form of antagonism. Now, I will go on to my conclusions, and I'll try to explain a little bit more why I talk about care fetishism specifically. So Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, as I very briefly outlined just a few minutes ago, I think can help us to throw into sharp relief not only the key difference between the understanding of interdependence by the ethics of care and social reproduction feminism, but also the reasons for such a difference. So Marx developed his concept of commodity fetishism to explain the very unique type of sociality that takes place under capitalism. It is a form of sociality in which the relations between people do not appear, quoting, as direct social relations between persons in their work, but rather as material relations between persons and social relations between things. End of the quote. In other words, Marx believed that the world of commodities deceives us somewhat into thinking that such commodities have a life of their own, just like fetishes, and to forget the real individuals who make them with their labor. On the other hand, commodities dominate people's lives to such an extent that people relate to each other through those commodities as buyers, sellers, or producers. So when Marx described the peculiar inversion of relationality induced by the world of commodities, what he had in mind was a world increasingly dominated by manufacture and productive labor within industrial factories. However, I would argue that something very similar, albeit, as I said, inverted in type, happens to the world of caring and social reproductive labor under capitalism. While in the world of commodities, we see the objects, so the commodities, but not the real people behind them, in the world of caring, we see the people, but not immediately the commodities behind them. The appearance of care as loving nature, which is the ideal type on which the ethics of care builds its whole theoretical and normative claims, as I said, lures somehow us into thinking that in a caring relationship, individuals relate to each other primarily through their innate emotions, which do not seem to have much to do with capitalist commodities. So as I argued already with a few examples, those feelings of love and affection can be very real, of course, and they are in fact very real and important for the people involved in the relation. But the realness, if you like, of those feelings does not cancel out the capitalist constraints behind the scenes. Those constraints are what complicates those feelings in important ways. So to illustrate this point, again, one could think of the ways in which care homes, for instance, represent the relationship between caregivers and care receivers. You might have seen their advertising strategy is to show us images of tender glances and reassuring hands caressing between the persons giving and receiving care. And this is because those images interpolate immediately our expectation that care is tantamount to affection and nurture. Care homes' advertising strategy here illustrates what scholars call care washing, namely the contemporary practices in which companies try to cleanse themselves from the connotations of corporate exploitation and instead affect the brand to a mode, an affect, an ethos, an idea of care. I'm here quoting from Chatsidakis and Joe Littler. Now, the example of care washing brings into play the fetish of care, I think, or the idealization of care as a selfless attention, which in fact conceals the capitalist stakes that lurk in the background. It could be objected that in the case of the salaried carer in the nursing home, it is clearer to see how the wage form mediates the relation with a frail patient. In this example, that is, we can more easily recognize that the carer cares for the money. She's doing that, they are doing that for the money, though the expectation remains that they develop a bond with the people they care for. More difficult is instead to appreciate the mediation of capitalist social relations in the case of the uncommodified relation between a parent and a child. As I already said, though, there are many ways in which we can actually see those capitalist mediation. So really to conclude, I think social reproduction feminism lifts the veil off the image of the idyllic and unencumbered interdependence between loving subjects by reminding us that the tempo of capitalist production dictates the time, energy, and also the very forms that people have available for caring, as well as our understanding of care itself. By focusing on caring as a form of labor that is influenced by and necessary for the reproduction of capitalist social relation, social reproduction feminism does, I think, enables us to see how the experience of care and interdependence can differ so much between people, since it is largely contingent, among other things, on their social position in the continuum of production and reproduction. Importantly, social reproduction feminism also explains why we can be misled to assume that capitalism has no bearing on caring relations, as it departs from a critique of the capitalist representation of care as feminine vocation rather than a social and economic activity. Social reproduction feminism demonstrates that caring is instead an essential component of the capitalist totality, which is shaped by capitalism as well as serving to reproduce it. I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
What a stunning set of insights, Sara. Thank you so much. I especially loved the idea of care as an economic activity, as well as the idea that under commodity production, you see the commodity, but not the labor of the producer, whereas in social reproduction, you see the person, but you don't see the kind of labor they have put in. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. So so you're making a really, really convincing case to pull back care into the totality of social reproduction, theoretically, where sort of dispelling some of the arguments or engaging with some of those arguments that the production of labor power lies outside of the circuit of capitalist production, may lie outside the circuit of normal commodity production, but not outside of capitalist production and reproduction. So this is fantastic. And I love how you have pulled in Cindy Katz's argument on this. So on that, I have a query. I'm just interested to know what you think. One of the words that often make me think about that brilliant definition of Cindy's is the word indeterminate, that social reproduction work is the messy, fleshy, indeterminate work that goes on. And I wonder how you would, given how you have positioned yourself, think of that word indeterminate, because in one sense, social reproduction labor is indeterminate, right? So, there is no, which is why, as some of us argue, that it doesn't produce, many of domestic labor activities do not produce value because there is no set time as to how you would change diapers or how I would change diapers, and we're not in competition with each other. But you are prompting us to think that, yes, it may be indefinitely flexible, but there is a horizon of limitations put on even social reproduction labor, which is the horizon of capital. So, or how do you think about it?
Do you want me to answer immediately
No, sorry, you're right. I should add. So, other folks, please raise your hand, and I can see that in the on the Zoom screen. Or if you are reluctant to speak, please type in your questions in the messages, and I can ask that for you.
Titi, can I just say, because I see somebody asking where they can get the article from. Actually, just before I joined you today, I was informed that the article has been published online. Is that okay if I paste it here in the chat?
Of course it is.
So I will do it because, yeah, I should have said at the beginning, what I presented today really is sections of the article that I just posted here. So you can read the full argument here. And it's totally by chance that it's been published today.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, further questions, please. Go ahead, Sue.
Hi, I'm so sorry for joining late. But I did catch a fair bit of the last probably third or whatever of your talk, Sarah. Thanks so much. And I guess this is maybe more a comment. I'm just wondering if you would comment back on it, I guess, than a question. But I'm just what your talk, what I heard of it made me think about was how the commodified care labor that you're talking about is unique in some ways too, because and this is just a different way I think of saying what you're saying. Maybe you could respond if that's true, because it so reveals the union of abstract and contract and concrete labor, right? Because you normally, if you think of a factory worker or whatever, you're going into a factory, and you think of the value that gets produced out of that, the value seems to be so separate from the actual concrete labor. Whereas maybe I'm wrong about this anyway, but whereas in the care work you see both the pressures of the abstract, the time and everything, because people have to rush to get their to their next client or whatever, if they're a PSW or whatever. So you see that along with the care that comes out of them just being concrete individual doing particular labor that they may or may not care a lot about, or they may or may not invest a lot of emotion in. But anyway, so that's I'm sorry, that's a bit rambling. But the reason I raise it is because I think one of the things that we often miss when we talk about labor under capitalism is that labor is also the space of resistance. And it's not a space of resistance because it is abstract labor. It's a space of resistance because it's concrete labor. And because people can choose not to work. They can choose to to do things differently. They can choose to extend the amount of time they spend with a client. They can, those are comments. And if you have any thoughts on them, I'd appreciate hearing them about them. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a comment here from Anna Marie. Oh, Anna Maria, I apologize. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting and very clear. I was wondering whether you think that care fetishism is something intrinsic to care theory because of their theoretical foundations, or whether it is something that is contingent and which could be addressed within care theory. So shall we start with those three, Sara, and then we can move on to some more? Go ahead.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So thanks for these very stimulating questions. I'm not sure how I can do justice to all the insights that you're bringing with them. Maybe I will start from the one by Anna Maria, because in a way is I think I can address this more easily. So I think that the care fetishism is intrinsic to the ethics of care. It is not contingent. And I think it is intrinsic because it is based upon the idealization of care as fundamentally positive affect. This is fundamental to the ethics of care, because the ethics of care, by its very nature, as it aims to be an ethics, has normative claims. And in having and in putting forward these normative claims, it has, we can say, a normative horizon on what is good and what is not good. That is why I think it is intrinsic to their theorization. They think there is, of course, some of them, there are some wonderful work done by some exponents of care ethics or that draw on care ethics. And some of them actually pointed out that there are some of these limitations, but ultimately they argue that they want to operate within the framework of ethics. And this ethics requires for them to, in a way, idealize what is this norm towards which we should move. And the norm is this caring as fundamentally good, as morally good. And the paradigmatic example is the mother-child relationship. So that's why I think I could say more about how, in a way, I think the ethics of care pushes us in some ways as a social reproduction feminism to think about what is our strategic horizon. Because in a way, if you look at the work of John Tronto, or even some aspects of the Care Manifesto, in a way, there is this endeavor to think of a better world, right? One in which caring is foregrounded, one in which positive relationships between individuals are nurtured and valorized. So actually, this is the aspect of this push by the care ethics that I would valorize. And sometimes I feel we should be doing more of this as social production feminists. But at the same time, the limit is that my idea is that they fundamentally lack a rigorous social theory or a rigorous social explanation that tells us why we have not achieved that caring horizon. And therefore, in lacking that, also the normative claims, in my view, crumble, become less realistic. So yeah, maybe I will close it here. I will need to think about your questions, Sue, to be honest, because I'm not entirely sure that I mean, I think labor is the space of resistance, whether it is waged on or unwaged, right? I think we agree on that. So in that sense, perhaps one of the ways of addressing what you said is one of the elements that we have within social reproduction feminism is it's a tension in a way, which is on the one hand, we think there is a space of liberation within social reproduction because it's precisely not being entirely commodified, right? And that is maybe that space of resistance that we see within this work, and also why we talk about social reproduction as life making. So in that sense, it is a space of resistance that, if I understand what you're saying, comes precisely from its place being not entirely within market relations. And in that sense, I think it has a special place in this continuum of production and reproduction. I try to speak a little bit about this in the article. And obviously, I think it is a tension within our paradigm itself. Now, I don't want to, again, have a tendency to speak too much, so I should maybe go to the next point by Titi. Your question about the indeterminate in syndicates. I hadn't thought about that, Titi, specifically. I didn't stress, I mean, I didn't think that was the key element in her argument. I think although I think that now also in the way in which you phrased it, in a way, what she's pointing out is precisely that social reproduction is what constitutes really our everyday life and what we do really in our life-making activities on a daily basis. And in that sense, it has that aspect of indeterminateness and really messiness, which she really likes to emphasize. Yeah, maybe I will now stop here. I can't hear you.
I'm afraid we're really running short of time because this has been such a wonderful discussion. I will take Alessandra Massadri's question. For those of you who are tuning in, Dr. Massadri is on this series as well, and she's going to be speaking later on. So please do tune in for her talk, which promises to be extremely stimulating as well. So her question, wonderful presentation. I wonder how this argument intersect, if at all, with debates on emotional labor and its extraction, either in the literature on care chains or in the theorizations by autonomous Marxism.
So if you want me to address this quickly, and now, Alessandra, thank you. This is a key question. I actually write about this in the article, and my argument there, very briefly, is that both discussions on emotional and affective labor in some ways have addressed or seemingly address the concerns of the ethics of care, when precisely because they immediately present and foreground the emotional and affective aspects of labor. But at the same time, I think they fell short of responding in a way to the concerns of care ethics. It's not necessarily their immediate concern, but it's not what would respond to care ethics, precisely because because they turn the affective experience and emotional labor as labor. And that's the way in which they foreground it. So it's not a foregrounding of the affective experience as positive, but it's precisely a foregrounding of labor. I would really leave it there because you can read a much more detailed explanation in the article. I wanted also to address maybe the other questions. As you were mentioning about the interdependence of care as an affect and care as a labor work, don't you think instead of care, we should call it caregiving when we are talking about the act of care work? I mean, care can be a thought too, but in that case, we call the person caring. But when that thought translates into action, it makes more sense to me to call it caregiving. What's your thoughts on that? Okay.
Sara, just to warn you, we literally
Yes.
have just 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. I thought we were leaving at 1:15. Oh, apologies.
No, that's okay. Go for it.
Okay, no, I haven't thought about that caregiving as something that would make a difference here. I mean, when we talk about care as labor, as we foreground it in the social reproduction feminism tradition, we are effectively talking about labor, so the doing of labor. In that sense, I guess it is a dimension of caregiving. So in that sense, I know that there is this distinction that's been foregrounded, for instance, in some of the literature on gender and migration, but I'm not sure how salient it is in the context of acknowledging and emphasizing that this is labor that takes place in certain contexts. I feel compelled to respond to the questions that I
Go
see.
for it. Because I apologize. It is till 1:15. I am so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking.
Oh, okay. So I
Go
did
for it.
correctly. Okay. So I apologize. When I see all the questions in the chat, I feel like I want to read them and I want to try to respond. So I'm
Yes.
sorry if I am a little bit short in my answers. It was my attempt at trying to address them and to think
Okay. No, no, no. You are absolutely right. So there is another question, but they can't seem to find. Why don't you just ask it?
May I ask it, please?
Yes, of course you may.
Thank you. I have a problem with my video too. Sorry for that.
That's okay.
Actually, I find all the discussion very interesting, and of course the presentation. But I am wondering. I mean, I was given the impression that the ethics of care feminism is taken as a whole. There are differences between them. Even more of that, the concept of care has a very long history. It is not only the ethics of care. For example, in Anglo-Saxon world, there are many Anglo-Saxon feminists. They have worked a lot on the concept of care, Agerson, etc., etc. It is not only the ethic of care. And between this strand of feminist theory of care, especially in social policy, there are also many differences. For example, Varnes, very early in 1980s, defined care as personal service as well as a caregiving. That is to say, she took in the power relationships, making the comment that it can be coercive, it can be no coercive, it can be in a framework of equal relationships and interdependence, or it can be in a context of subversion and how should I say, of a very of the worst experience. This is very simplified, but it is not only feminists have many different school of thoughts and many strands from
Comrade,
where
would you mind
it comes to care.
summarizing?
Yes, this is what I try to say. It is not only the ethics of care. There is a very huge literature on the concept of care from a feminist standpoint that takes in many different positions,
Thank you.
the definition of that.
Thank you. Srishti, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was trying to formulate the question clearly in my head. I'll just try to ask it. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I was interested in learning a little about how social reproduction feminism looks at migrational bodies and how migrant workers, have to reproduce a particular kind of labor capacity in the foreign markets, while also taking care of social reproduction labor if they are caregivers in that market, and how that perhaps has particular fashioning around the commodification slash non-commodifications of the liberatory aspects of care labor.
Thanks, Srishti. That's all Sarah's book, so you should definitely take a look
absolutely.
at that. Erin, you have your hand up? Yes, go ahead.
So I think this is maybe more of a comment of what I found so valuable in the presentation is that I think there's a nice set of resources you've developed here, Sarah, to push back on some kind of insufficient, I don't know, maybe there's some criticisms of care ethics, but not from a social reproduction feminist standpoint, right? They might say that there's all sorts of problems with domination or different versions of oppression internal to how care is inappropriately ethicized in too flat of a way.
Erin, you're frozen.
Oh no, am I still frozen?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Well, hold that thought, Sara. I'll ask the next question and we'll come back to Erin. Oh, here you are. Go ahead, finish up.
Sorry. I'm aware of some criticisms of care ethics that also reject a social reproduction feminism, and try to do so by acknowledging multiple forms of oppression or try to criticize social reproduction feminism for a too narrow focus on class or labor. And I just thought it was excellent to provide the resources to push back on that, right? Like a broad notion of labor from the young Marx, a notion of interdependence that flows from social complexity with a really advanced division of labor. But those feel like a set of intellectual resources to defend a social reproduction view of how to conceive of care and what's normative within it. And I thought that was immensely valuable.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Since that's not a question, we'll ask this one that's right here from Ian. I want to ask about the dialectic side of care, neglect. How are we also oriented to not care by the totality of social relations in capitalism? In the context of non-commodified care that are outside of market relations, there are also limits to who we care for, and this is often due to social relations of kinship and community boundaries. How can SRT conceptualize care as an effective orientation within the broader totality of social relations that also socially reproduce systems of difference?
Okay.
All right, over to you.
Okay, so to address the previous question, I am sorry that I don't remember now who asked that about the different definitions of care and not just the ethics of care. Yeah, absolutely. That's why I tried to be careful and really speak only about the ethics of care. This is because, of course, I am aware that the concept of care has been conceptualized also within other paradigms, not necessarily just the ethics of care. I also use this concept. As Titi also mentioned, I work on migration and particularly on migrant women who are employed as care workers, waged care workers primarily in care homes or nurses, etc. So this is my primary field. And by doing that, inevitably, I have worked with the concept of care, including the concepts that you mentioned by Angerson on the commodification of care, the marketization of care, and others. So this is really just to clarify that this is really a notion. The concept of care has been really used by many different traditions, conceptualized, is so much linked to discussions on the welfare state, as well, for example, that it is really impossible just to use one definition of care simply because there is not such a thing. That's why, just to give you an example, I even tried when I was writing this article and trying really to develop these ideas, I also had to be careful in drawing a distinction between the ethics of care and the politics of care. Because, for example, there is the work of John Tronto in many ways, which in many ways draws and enriches the ethics of care, but also has its own differences. So if you ask me, I feel closer and I prefer the work of Tronto, for instance, to the work of Virginia Held, but that's precisely because Tronto makes an effort, and I think she makes she really wrote beautiful articles about how we need to first of all understand the declassification of care, for instance, in the political canon, in the history of political thought, as apolitical. She wrote beautifully and eruditely about that, but at the same time, she draws on the ethics of care. But this is to say, there is definitely not one definition. There are many, and I try to be quite careful in narrowing down specifically to the ethics of care. If you read the article, you will see that there are certain authors in particular that I quote. And to go to, there was also the question on migrant labor, if I remember it correctly, and how we understand the work of migrant women through social reproduction feminism. In many ways, that's been my attempt for many years now, really trying to in a way, it seems like it goes without saying that migrant women employed as care workers, as nurseries, childminders, etc., are doing social reproductive work. And in that sense, of course, the social reproduction feminism framework helps us to understand those aspects. On the other hand, I think that the ways, let's put it this way, the fact that so much of waged, commodified social reproduction now, and since really the late 1970s and 1980s, has been increasingly done by migrant women, also really pushes us as social reproduction feminists to rethink, to readapt some of our categories and really to develop our framework. So to give you an example, Lise Vogel in her work, I think is quite explicit that when we talk about the reproduction of labor power, we are talking about the reproduction of the proletariat labor power. We are talking about the reproduction of the working class and the working class labor power. If you think about the work that many migrant women do, it really forces you to think, is this the reproduction of the working class families? Sometimes it is, often it is not, or it is not directly, because we are talking about the reproduction often of wealthy families that employ migrant care workers or middle-class families. So I guess here it is about understanding how do we understand as Marxist feminists the middle classes, which will take us into many other directions. But this is just to say, I think social reproduction feminism, I think it's key to understanding the commodification of social reproduction, particularly since the inception of neoliberal capitalism, to understanding the marketization and so on and so forth. But it also, these new realities and the intensity of these new realities, I think also in a way pushes us to rethink, reconsider, think again some of these and I'm not sure if to say categories or, for example, but at least, for example, something that Lise Vogel wrote, although she was writing in a very specific context that should also be made clear. The last question, I'm sorry, I was a little bit long on this. I have to read it again because I'm not sure I understood. In the context of non-commodified care, so outside market relations, there are also limits to who we care for. An affective orientation. I think there are two questions you're asking here. That's at least the way I understand it. Well, I guess the issue is certainly, we can say capitalism, which in fact, talking about commodity fetishism and the work of Kevin Floyd, he also calls it a mode of production that leads to forms of asocial sociality. So it is a form of sociality that in the end actually leads to the impoverishment of meaningful relationships between people. So in that sense, certainly there is a push, let's say now in these simplistic ways, there is a push from capitalism not to care in a way that we would consider meaningful. So really just mind your business, do your work, go home, not to care about people who are suffering, and really being isolated into in a way, your own bubbles. There is definitely this element. I think, as I tried to say earlier, but I find this thought also a little bit harder to conceptualize and to express, as I was trying to address what Sue said earlier. I think a social reproduction feminism, and perhaps we need to push it a little bit more in this direction, also really tries to tell us care, the work that we do, the social reproductive work that we do to reproduce life, to reproduce labor power, of course, it has fundamentally an oppressive and component. It is world that is dominated by capitalism. A lot of it is not done for fun because we love it, But we also, doing that work, there are many aspects that we do for love, and I think that one of the aims of social reproduction feminism is precisely to understand, to foreground capitalism as the primary culprit here, precisely in order to say, we can rescue, these relationships can be meaningful, this work can be really, in a way, love, which does not mean necessarily that it won't be complicated, and murky still, even in a non-capitalist context. But that's the type of goal that in a way, that we have to try to really say that we want to abolish capitalism. I think it's precisely to affirm care as a real as the real labor of love, if you like, that is not immediately determined by these capitalist exploitative constraints. So,
Inshallah to that. And thank you so much, Sara. We should definitely end on that note every single time. So please give Dr. Farris a round of applause, and please do not hesitate to write to us about any social reproduction talks that you have heard recently or that you would like us to publicize. We are thinking of producing a newsletter out of the series, which we hope will be permanent. And we really hope that you will log on to Dr. Masadri's talk, which is on October 15th. It's in the chat. And thank you for logging in, and thank you, Sara, for this amazing, stimulating talk. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Erin and Sue and Sara, do you want to stay on for a bit? Vipanchika, would you mind?